Hey everybody, here to talk about Fedor Emelianenko, why I think he's the best fighter of all time. You guys can talk about who you guys think is the greatest. I believe it's Fedor. At the end of this video, when I get done talking about Fedor, why I think he's the greatest of all time, I'm going to talk about other fighters that are constantly being brought up as the GOAT and why I don't think they are the greatest of all time. So let's get to it. Who's Fedor fought? Good question. He has fought anywhere from pro wrestling champions to good fighters, scary guys that never won titles, but nobody wanted to mess with at the time. He fought UFC stars, guys that went on to be UFC champions, or guys that were UFC champions before they fought Fedor. Other organizations that were never talked about as much as UFC or Bellator, Pride, those champions. The long winning streak, we'll talk about that in a second. He's had fight of the year before, I think. I think his fight with Prokop was fight of the decade. I'll talk about that fight also. K1 champions, Prokop. So let's talk about who in particular he's beaten. Looking at his record, I wanted to do this without my phone. He beat Ricardo Arona. Arona fought in the Pride Fighting Championships also. He was a middleweight, but he didn't fight him in Pride. He fought him in rings. He beat him up. He won a decision. Arona was a rings champion, I believe. He fought former UFC title challenger Yoshi Kosaka. He beat him up. He actually fought once in rings, and that was his first loss. He got cut open, and they ended up stopping it. And ironically, they fought years later in Pride, and Fedor dominated him. So he fought him, he beat him. Let's talk about other good fighters. Gary Goodridge. And you guys don't know who Gary Goodridge is, you're not a big MMA fan. Gary Goodridge was a guy that fought in the UFC, and he also fought in Pride. He fought a lot in Japan. He was a good kickboxer in his prime. He's knocked out Don Fry. He's knocked out a lot of guys in his career. This is a guy that a lot of good fighters, champions, beat, but nobody wanted to fight. Fedor got a hold of him. Look it up on YouTube. It's out there. He beat the crap out of him. And this guy was a scary guy in his day. He's fought, like I said, Prokop. Prokop was a K1 champion. He was a Pride Openweight Grand Prix champion. Went on to be champion in 2006, but they fought in 05. Prokop also won a Ryzen or Risen, whatever it's called, Grand Prix title as well. And the reason why I talk about this fight is because those two were clearly the best heavyweights in the world in terms of the Pride Fighting Championship, not UFC, And Prokop was a guy that killed people standing up. I think it was right leg hospital, left leg cemetery. He used to kick people in the head and knock them out with it. Fedor is the only guy I've seen when Prokop was young have Prokop going backwards most of the fight when they were standing. And he beat him like that. He didn't finish it, but he went on to win a decision. It was a good fight. But the way Fedor beat him was just so unique. See, Fedor always had good wrestling, sambo. He could submit guys. He said, no, I want to stand with this guy and make a statement with this guy. And he did it. He did go on to do that. Of course, a lot of guys beat Prokop in MMA, but a lot of those losses came in the later years when Prokop was already past his prime, like most fighters go. All fighters go through. Not most of them. All of them do. He beat Prokop. He beat Minotaur Nogueira. He's a UFC Hall of Famer. He went on to be an interim UFC world champion. He was Pride's first heavyweight champion at the time. Nogueira made a name for himself by beating guys like 7 feet tall or huge guys. Bob Sapp. He beat Heath Herring, who was also a killer, and he had a hard time in every fight he fought him. Heath Herring's a notable fighter. Used to be real famous. He got real popular in Japan by fighting the best. He beaten some of the best guys. And Fedor beat him also, by the way. And when he beat Nogueira, Nogueira was beating all these guys. And Fedor was relatively unknown. This is where Fedor became Pride champion. He beat this guy so bad. He had him bleeding. He controlled the ground game. Everybody was talking, Nogueira's going to submit Fedor. Who's Fedor? He was in Nogueira's guard, and Nogueira's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. And look at the way he beat him. He actually beat him twice. But the way he beat him the first time was so dominant, he took the title away. And even the commentary at the end of the fight, when he went to distance, we were saying Fedor has taken the title. It's obvious. A lot of the times a world championship fight's pretty close or very competitive. That one wasn't. And Nogueira is a scary guy. So to beat him not once but twice when he was young, before he took all the damage he did later in the UFC with Frank Mir and Velasquez, that says a lot. Because I think only Fedor and I think Josh Barnett beat Nogueira in Pride, right? I might be wrong, but he beat him twice. Speaking of champions, guys that were UFC champions, he beat Kevin Randleman after Kevin Randleman picked him up and slammed him on his head. He's a former UFC heavyweight champion. He came back and getting dunked on his head to finish it with a Kimura lock. And he beat his coach, another former UFC champion, another UFC Hall of Famer. Rest in peace, Kevin Reynolds, by the way. Mark the Hammer Coleman. He beat him twice. And what was so good about it was he said Mark Coleman, he idolized Mark Coleman. He admired how he fought. He wanted to fight just like he did, take guys down and just beat the crap out of him with that ground and pound. Only he took it to a whole nother level with the submissions, and he can stand better than Mark Coleman. He submitted him twice and had his way both times. What else did he do? Who else did he beat? Like I said, he beat Crow Cop. Kazuyuki Fujita, a former IWGP World Champion. And this is a tricky fight. This was right after the first Nogueira fight in 2003. I think it was Pride 26. Fujita, nobody gave him a chance to win. And Fedor was losing this fight for a little while. But somehow, Fedor comes back and gets him with a rear naked choke after getting busted up. He's bleeding in the fight, and he wins. I emphasize that because this guy's a world champion in pro wrestling, but also fought in MMA, you know, so that's a big deal. Who else did he fight? Now let's go on past his Pride days. Oh, by the way, he also won the 2004 Pride Heavyweight Grand Prix, and guess what? He beat Nogueira in the finals. So there you go. He's undefeated. He was undefeated in Pride. Nobody else fought as many times as he did and was undefeated. When Pride was purchased by the UFC, he was the last champion. So he held that title for 4 years. He didn't go to the UFC. He said his management couldn't get along with Dana White and their management. That they tried to make Brock Lesnar versus Fedor. I'll talk about that later. Fast forward, he fights in Affliction. And he fights Andrei Arlovsky and Tim Sylvia. Now, when people hear these names, they say, well, Andrei's done. He's retired, or he should be retired. Let me remind y'all, Andrei Arlovsky was a scary guy back in 2004, 5, 06. And 08, 09, he was still in his prime. You know, he was still dangerous, and he was still knocking guys out. He hit real hard. He was real fast for a heavyweight. He had kind of like light heavyweight speed, but he was dangerous. And this guy was UFC heavyweight champion at one point, so you know he's relevant if you mention his name. I had never seen, I've seen Arlovsky get TKO'd at Pedro Hizo by Rodriguez, I think. And Tim Sylvia beat him twice, but he never got hit with one punch like Fedor did. And that's where I emphasize Fedor. He always found a way to win fights, even if he's losing the fight. Kazuyuki Fujita was beating him up. If you watched Arlovsky fight, he was losing to Arlovsky until Arlovsky got reckless and tried to hit him with a flying knee, and boom, caught him and knocked him out cold with one punch. And of course, Arlovsky has gone on to get knocked out with one punch in his later years, but I think that was the first time that happened. And then fast forward to Tim Sylvia. Tim Sylvia is a former two-time UFC heavyweight champion. He had defended the title 3 times, right? 3 times, 2 times consecutively in his second title defense. Fedor eat him up easily. I say Sylvia because Randy Couture had beaten Tim Sylvia, but he took him the distance. Nogueira had a hard time with Sylvia, submitted him. Fedor submitted him, but he beat him in 30 seconds. He literally hit him 3 or 4 times real hard. And Tim Sylvia didn't know what to do. He went down. He made Sylvia look like an amateur and choked him out. And Sylvia was a scary guy in his prime. And he was world champion and big name, you know, a real big name. Well respected in the MMA community at one point. And still is today as far as being a legend. He beat him. He was their WAMA heavyweight champion. So he had a title defense against Arlovsky. Or he won it with Sylvia. It's one or the other. But he did win a title over there or something. That's why he's also... And now let's... I know he lost. He went on to lose 3 fights in a row in Strikeforce. But again, every champion, everybody that has fought for so long, have been so dominant, they start losing fights, and then they got to figure themselves out. I think every champion does that. I think Fedor it was his time to lose. You know, if that makes sense. Because again, this reign went from 2000 all the way to like 2010 when Fabricio Verdum submitted him. By the way, he lost to Verdum, but Verdum went on to be UFC heavyweight champion. By the way. Bigfoot Silva beat him up. Dan Henderson knocked him out in 1 punch. Before that, he was losing the fight to Fedor anyway. And Dan Henderson's a legend, multi-time world champion. Fedor went on to knock out Pedro Hizo, who fought for the UFC title, was a star back in the day, and was a scary guy. Nobody wanted to mess with him. He knocked him out, made it look easy. I know, and the fights I'm about to talk about is when Fedor's past his prime, or he's not in his younger days. But the guys I'm mentioning, They aren't neither. So it's basically the same time period where they never fought when Fedor was in Pride. So that's why it makes sense, you know. Fast forward to 2000. I think he retired for a few years. He comes back and he enters the Bellator Grand Prix. He fights Frank Mir. Now, Frank Mir is a big deal because at the time when Fedor was champion in 04 or 05, Frank Mir won the title also. He broke Tim Sylvia's arm. Frank Mir also didn't just beat Nogueira twice, he finished him twice. Some people can argue and say that's better than what Fedor did to Nogueira in Pride. So you can argue and say these were the two best heavyweights in the world during that time that never got to lock up and see each other. Well, they fought each other. And the thing is, if you look at Frank Mir lately, and even in his 2015-16 days, with late UFC days and early Bellator days, he never really looked like he was... I'm not saying he didn't take fighting seriously, but you could tell he was past his time. But when he fought Fedor for that one fight, he came up, he looked shredded, he looked in shape. He had Fedor hurt, and Fedor hadn't won a fight in a long time. Decisively, he knocked out Frank Mir. So what makes Fedor special is he ran through everybody from his time period and beat them all. That way he could say he truly dominated his division. Because we see all these champions today, and like Jon Jones, for example, he never fought Anthony Johnson. I'm sure he probably would have won, but there's also that hint of doubt. You know, so we've seen Cain Velasquez, he fought Dos Santos, he beat Bigfoot, but he never fought Overeem. He never fought, you know, other guys that were up there. He never fought him because he's hurt. Is it his fault? No, but he can't say he was dominant, or even Stipe was as dominant as Fedor. That's why I say Stipe is not better than Fedor. He can't. Sorry, it don't matter who you fought for. The names are there. He beat the names. Now, if Fedor had gone on to not beat anybody all those years, then I can argue and say, yeah, he's not the greatest of all time. He's a great fighter, but if you put him in there with competition, he had the competition. I left a few names out. He also, in 2019, knocked out Rampage Jackson. I know Rampage got out of shape and stuff, but still he did it. You know, they're both from the same time period. Rampage fought in Pride the same time Fedor did. Who else? He beat Chael Sonnen. Chael Sonnen is an interesting character. He never won a world title in MMA, but he always fought the best guys. He beat a lot of the best guys. He was such a good wrestler. He was very tough. Jon Jones ran through him, but let's be honest, Jon Jones didn't have a hard fight until he took Gustafsson lightly the first time. So before that, he ran through everybody. I wasn't surprised. But he gave Anderson Silva a hard time too. And Chael Sonnen, I quoted, said that he was asked who hit you the hardest out of Jones, Silva, and Fedor. He said easily Fedor. And the thing is, how he hits, how focused he is. And let me tell you another reason why Fedor is the greatest of all time. You look at all the champions, right? MMA champions, Strikeforce, Bellator, Pride, UFC, whatever you know. I've never seen another champion that was so dominant and so focused, that never let his ego get away from him, that never thought about anything else, or had excuses, or had an attitude, or brought the drama in like Fedor. Fedor was always so cool, calm, collected. He was nice. He'd just shake your hand, probably give you a hug, you know, say nice things about you before the fight. He was supposed to fight Frank Mir years before they actually fought. And he actually said, Fedor's a nice guy. I'd like to hang out with him sometime. I don't know if he meant that, but he sold it pretty well, you know. But he still came in there to rip your head off, and he did, you know. I admire that about Fedor because he let his fighting do the talking. He didn't do a lot of this, like the Colby Covingtons, the Jorge Masvidals. I'm not insulting fighters, but Conor McGregor's, the guys that are good fighters, but do a lot of this to promote the fight when they should just be using this. As a hardcore MMA fan, I think most of you understand that. I think Fedor, if Fedor were to go to the UFC right now, I don't know how successful he would be, but I'm sure he would sell if Dana White said, Francis Ngannou has to fight Stipe Miocic for a third time. 2 weeks later, Stipe's out with an injury. Guess whose replacement's going to be? Fedor's going to fight him for the heavyweight title in his retirement fight. That fight would sell just because people have talked about Fedor. And Fedor has never been nasty, had an attitude. He's always been so respectful. And with the media, I've never heard one thing bad about Fedor. So to be so dominant and have the character that he had and still has, that's pretty impressive. I value those things. Now let's talk about another reason why I say he's the greatest of all time. Cheating. I've never once heard about him taking steroids, and you can look at him and tell he looked the same every fight from his younger days to today. He looks the same. A little flabby, but obviously in shape, strong, durable. He had good stamina. Excuse me, I had a burp there. And he never had any controversy about him, you know. He never tested positive. You know, I think he was a clean fighter. I still think he is a clean fighter. And I think that kind of fighter like him or anybody in general deserves more respect. Now, I'm not on here to badmouth fighters. Now I'm going to tell you why I don't think some of these guys are the greatest of all time. Let's talk about the obvious suspect, Jon Jones. If Jon Jones never tested positive, he would be undoubtedly the greatest of all time because he did what he did at 22, 23 years old, youngest UFC champion of all time. He ran through the whole light heavyweight division, and he took Gustafsson lightly the first time, clearly, because when they fought again, he dominated him, and he still found a way to win the first fight anyway. Because outside of that, Gustafsson has not really been known for much of anything, unfortunately. You know, I like Gustafsson. Shout out to Gustafsson, by the way. You know, Jon Jones, longest reigning light heavyweight champion in UFC history. If you compare that to Japan, like Pride. Pride was middleweight, same thing. More dominant than Vanderlei Silva was. More dominant than Frank Shamrock. That means he was more dominant than Tito Ortiz. He's more dominant than anybody Bellator's ever had. So, for that reason, he would be considered the greatest of all time. And if he passed his drug test, DC would have literally no excuse. Or Gustafsson coming into the second fight say, hey, you taking steroids. You got illegal stuff in your body. That kind of taints him a little bit. And I don't like to judge him. I like Jon Jones. But if you're going to tell me to say he's the greatest of all time, I'm just not going to do it. That's not fair. He's a surefire number 2 because of his talent, his God-given fighting abilities, and his heart in the fight. Because even though let's say he did take steroids and it was in his system, so you can say he did. Steroids have nothing to do with the talent to kick somebody in the head and put him out. Either you got the talent or you don't. Either you got the heart to keep fighting, to never give up, or you don't. Okay? Speaking of steroids, Anderson Silva has tested positive for steroids before. After the Nick Diaz fight. And that tells me he probably did it throughout his career. I'm sorry, Anderson Silva was so talented, he was so dominant, but if he's taking steroids and he gets caught with it, I'm sorry, I can't put you up there with the best, man. That's not fair. I could put him at number 3. I think Jones was a better fighter than Anderson was. Sorry, man. I know all the names he beat and all that, but the steroids tarnishes that. Brock Lesnar, obvious reason. Steroids, he didn't really put the, I'm not going to look at the fact that he didn't put the time into MMA. It shouldn't matter. He went in like off of one fight in Japan and he put up a fight with Frank Mir, then he beat him in the rematch, but he needed 2 chances to beat him when Fedor beat him once. He beat Randy Couture, but Couture was obviously past his prime. He didn't have much left in him as a fighter, but Randy Couture's a big name. He had a hard fight with Shane Carwin. He got dominated by Cain Velasquez. This is what I didn't like about Brock Lesnar. He lost, and he didn't really, well, I understand. I mean, he makes a lot of money with WWE, so why would he have to go bad? Ronda Rousey did the same thing, so I can't really complain about that. I was going to say he was a quitter, but he's not a quitter, obviously. He just wants money. I don't think he's a quitter. That's wrong of me to say. Sorry, Brock. Which brings me to Stipe Miocic. Stipe, of course, beat guys like Overeem. He beat Arlovsky. He beat Cormier twice. He beat, who else did he beat? Verdum to be champion. That's something Fedor didn't do. And that can be debatable in terms of being the GOAT. But here's the problem with Stipe. Some of the guys like Mark Hunt. I forgot, Fedor beat Mark Hunt too in Pride. He beat him in his prime. He submitted him after Mark Hunt was running through people in Pride. And was having so much momentum behind him. The problem with saying Stipe's the GOAT, and not just a heavyweight, but in history, Stipe did not dominate as long as Fedor did. And the guys like Arlovsky and Overeem, those guys he beat, Junior Dos Santos, those guys, I think their best years were kind of behind them, you know. I know Overeem was great, and obviously today he's still a dangerous fighter. But like 3-4 years later, he gets cut from the UFC, and you could tell he started getting knocked out more and started losing more fights. I think Overeem in his Pride days and up to like 2010, 2011, he was more dangerous. So I'm not sure if Stipe would have beat him at all or if the same way. Dos Santos had been through those fights with Velasquez, and that kind of put a lot on him. So to say that he's going to win the title after that would be unlikely. I understand that. You know, nothing against Junior. I love Junior. But the guys that Stipe beat, and when he fought Francis the first time, clearly Francis did not take him seriously. If Francis had trained right and took him seriously, what happened in the second fight would have happened the first time, and Francis probably would have 4 or 5 title defenses. I'm not trying to discredit Stipe, but a lot of his wins came from guys I think had their better years behind them, and a guy like Francis who has his ego. Now that's a guy who I think can be the greatest of all time, but I don't know if he can because he's been known to let his ego get away, and he ends up losing fights he shouldn't lose, like the Derrick Lewis. Come on, man, you better than Derrick Lewis. You can beat him. But in my opinion, for that reason, Stipe is the GOAT because he beat the best guys that were in his era. He beat all of them. There's no question. He dominated his era better than anybody else ever did. And he won championships too. And the guys he beat, a lot of them were UFC champions or fought for the title, big stars, scary guys, and he made it look easy. And again, he had sloppy fights with some fighters like Kazuyuki Fujita, who was mostly a professional wrestler from New Japan, a world champion. But again, that's pro wrestling and MMA are two different things, you know. So, but still, he found ways to win those fights, and he had big names in there on top of that I've already mentioned. So if any of you want to argue with me about this, I'll leave it up to you guys. I respect your opinions, but I really don't care what it is, because I think Fedor is the greatest. So if your opinion is not related to agreeing with mine, I could care less. You can argue with me, but hey, it's all good. Fedor is the best, and that's just what it is, man. Like, comment, subscribe. We're going to talk later about something else, alright? Peace.